Welcome to Analogous Propinquity. That's a mouthful, isn't it? I'm Paul Baker, and I've been around radio for part of my life. That was a few years ago, but I had my first love in the broadcast medium. And from there, I went into IT and worked as an IT tech for the past couple of decades. And now we're here doing this podcast, and we are me, Jim Bowers, former chair of the political science department
at some college whose name will go nameless.
Okay. It's a university.
At some college whose name will go nameless. But yes, I've been around a while. In fact, Paul is one of the first people who brought me in as a political analyst commentator many, many years ago when he was a talk show host. I've also been an elected public official. Served a term on the city school board in the city where we reside. I ran for city council, lost. But I've also done some political consulting. But to even back up a second, since Paul did say that is clearly a mouthful, our analogous propinquity, I have to admit I wanted propinquity in the title because I just like saying the word.
A little bit of definition probably doesn't hurt. Propinquity is a concept in social science, and basically it's the idea of attraction and what brings people together.
And I'm very attracted.
And there you go. And
I'm very attractable.
And analogous goes back to analogy, which is a way that we often look at the world by comparing things to other things. It was a favorite method of the Buddha, the Christ, and a lot of other really neat people in antiquity. And we've got a few people here who are probably right around there.
Yeah. And lastly, propinquity, I first got introduced to the word in a Mike Nesmith song, which is one reason I like it too. Yeah. And speaking of another person who is full of propinquity, is our guest this season. This is going to be a episode 1 of a season we're going to do on a master class in campaign strategy, and our guest this entire season is Arnie Rothschild, who is a very successful veteran campaign strategist, one of the best I've been exposed to, and an all-around swell guy, too.
Thank you for that as well.
So should we maybe have Arnie tell us a little bit about himself?
Oh, definitely.
Just a little bit, and then we'll get into some questioning and things.
I originally came from the broadcasting industry, but I grew up around politics. I'm from Syracuse originally. My dad was a party chair. One of his best friends, who was a treasurer of the other party, was the father to a man named Terry McAuliffe, who became the governor of Virginia. We all grew up together and grew up around politics, but it wasn't until we were selling radio stations that I started doing election work, which is about 26 or 7 years ago. Been in over 200 elections around New York State that have ranged from congressional elections, state senate elections, New York State Assembly elections, local elections, and the one thing that I found in over 200 elections is that people approach them in illogical ways, and that there really is a different kind of mindset that you can have that helps you win elections.
Now, we said that analogy is one of the things that we're going to be working with, and Arnie actually brought to Jim an analogy of politics and harness racing.
All horse racing, yeah. So I'm actually, in another part of my life, a licensed harness driver and trainer. And I have said over years that a lot of what I learned about running elections, I learned by watching horses, because we're now in Triple Crown season. During post parade, I want you to take a look at the equipment that each horse wears, because in racing, when you're training a horse, you don't start with the same equipment on every horse. What you do is you watch what the horse needs, what the horse is doing, what the horse is focused on, and you begin to adjust how you train and what they wear based on what they need. Well, now in elections, for the most part, most people trying to run elections say, okay, first you do the bio stage, then what you do is you You, after you introduce yourself, you talk about why you're running, and they have this whole sequence of events that are no longer meaningful or logical, but it's the way people learned to do them. So,
well, but before we go fully into the analogy, which is what this episode and possibly the next one will be, I want to spend a little bit more time on you as a harness racer.
Okay.
How does one get into that?
So when I got out of college, and I had never been around a horse, a friend of mine who was a school teacher owned 2 cheap, slow trotters that were racing at Vernon Downs. And we went to the New York State Fairgrounds where they were training, and he went in to talk to the trainer. And there was a mare in a stall, and she was weaving back and forth and kind of just weaving and back in the corner of the stall. And so I stood at the stall door just kind of quietly and was whispering to her. And eventually she walked up to me, and I put my hand on her neck, and she just kind of leaned into me. And the trainer came around the corner and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I have no idea. I was talking to her." And he said, "That mare's been having a nervous breakdown. I can't believe you got her to come to you." And I said, "Well, I have no idea why." So I was kind of fascinated by it. So the next day I went to the barn again, and they were walking an old gelding away from me. And I looked at the trainer and said, "Why is it that his right rear foot twists a little bit as it leaves the ground?" He said, "What are you talking about?" And he yelled to the groom, "Bring that horse," whose name was Ceiling Zero, "bring him back, walk him away from me." And he walked the horse back and away from him. And the trainer said, "That's an early stage of stifle lameness. How did you see that?" I said, "I not only don't know how I saw it, I don't even know what I saw." So beginning the next day, I was at the barn trying to learn how to take care of horses, began to jog horses, began to learn to train horses, went out to the county fair circuit, driving horses so that I could better understand how to train them. But if you kind of believe in genetic predisposition in learning, in my lineage were some of the best horse trainers in Europe in the Rothschild family. So for whatever reason, I have an understanding of horses at a different level, and I'd never been able to explain it.
Okay, 2 quick important questions.
Yes, sir.
One, what was your win-loss total? Did you race competitively?
Oh, yeah.
What was your win-loss? Roughly.
I have to think that through. I could look it up.
No, that's okay.
No, but the first 5 races that I drove, I had 2 wins, 2 thirds, and finished up the track and won. So, I got off to a good start.
Okay. The next one. Regular jockeys get to wear these fancy silk-like stuff. Mm-hmm. Did you have your silks?
Yes. So
what was your colors?
So they were white, Columbia blue, and Kelly green. So in harness racing, unlike thoroughbred racing, the jockey wears the color of the farm, the breeding farm. In harness racing, each driver has their own colors. And so mine were assigned by the United States Trotting Association, and no 2 drivers can wear the same color design.
We need to have T-shirts made up like that.
Oh, that would be nice.
I think it should be, and we can, Arnie's Trotters. Okay, I'm done.
Yeah,
we can go to the serious stuff now.
Interestingly enough, Arnie, I don't know if I ever mentioned this to you, but my paternal grandfather actually came to the United States in the early 20th century and ended up training horses for the U.S. infantry.
Wow.
Or for the cavalry, not for the infantry, but for the cavalry out in Derby, New York.
And it's interesting that this part of New York State, by the way, was a really good breeding area for both harness horses and thoroughbreds because of the balance of calcium and phosphorus in the soil, and so the bone structure was really good. But to the end of your question, Doctor, I don't know why it works, but I did learn a lot because I didn't know, so I had to watch a lot. And what I saw became a roadmap for me as I went into the business of running political races, because I didn't do things just because someone told me that's how it worked. I did things based on what I saw in the race. So if I may just, very quickly, let me tell you something I shared. So I was challenging some young political operatives in Albany that worked for the Assembly. And I said to them in the first session, why do you send press releases out for candidates? And they said, because that's what you do. People send press releases out. And I said, okay. So there's this young couple that gets married, and it's Easter, and the wife says to the husband, what do you like for Easter dinner? And he said, I've always loved whole hams. And so she said, the wife said, then I'm getting you a whole ham. And so they got the whole ham, and she was preparing it, and she cut 2 inches off of each end of the ham. And the husband said, why did you cut 2 inches off the end of the ham? And she said, because my mother did. He said, well, let's call your mom and find out why she cut 2 inches off the end of the ham. They called the mother, and she said, I don't know, because my mother did. So I said, well, let's call Grandma and find out why she cut ends off the ham. So they called Grandma, and Grandma said, I cut the ends off the ham because we didn't have a pan big enough for the ham. And I said, so now tell me again why you send out press releases, because press releases were the product of a period of time when newspapers broke the news. But today, radio and television break or online breaks the news. So you're writing press releases to someone that it makes no sense to send them to them. But if you wrote one today, you'd write it as a backgrounder and you'd embed an audio file and a video file. That would be the communication form of today, but you are cutting the ends off of hams. You're doing something because someone told you it works.
We've always done it that way before.
We've always done it that way.
Well, but even your analogy kind of plays into that in this regard. I don't know how many times I taught at, whether it was American national government or, of course, in campaign and elections, and we see this in the news media all the time. They're comparing the horse race. Mm-hmm. But what they're comparing is candidate to candidate, that matchup. Your analogy goes into the actual operation and the running of the race, as opposed to, the head-to-head, who's ahead, who's behind.
So when we come down to it, Arnie, it's not just horses and drivers in that race. It's a sulky. It's all the tack. It's the track itself. It's the groomers. It's the folks that groom the track.
And it's the other horses in the race. And so what ends up, every race that I've been in, every election that I've been in, and, this is going to sound pretty dramatic, but in over 200 elections, I can't tell you that any two elections were actually the same. I can tell you that a lot of operatives in the business of running elections see all elections as the same, and that's why they lose. We had a mayoral primary in the city of Rochester, and 2.5 weeks out, the Siena poll said that the sitting mayor at the time was going to beat the challenger, a woman candidate, by 26 points. And yet we won the primary by 9 because every supposition they made was flawed, including the way they were conducting the polling. Right now, if you watch, we are doing national polls of Republican candidates for president. There is nothing more meaningless than a national poll for president because we don't have a national election for president. Right. We have a bunch of local elections. So in the business of running elections, the only thing that's similar is the differences. They will be there, and you have to look for them. And if you're not looking for them, if you're just repeating known patterns, you're cutting the ends off of hams. Last point of this. We all know that in politics, historically, the first stage we called the bio stage. It is where you gave your resume. I've been doing focus groups around the state where people say, don't tell me about yourself. In the era of the internet, I can find out all I want to find out about you. Tell me what you're going to do for me if I vote for you. That's a dramatic change, but it's a change you have to look for. Now, when I say that to people, even today, they go, well, that's not how races are run.
Is it all that big a change, though, Arnie? And I mean, past becomes prelude sometimes. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking of a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage.
And, the interesting thing about that, those were solutions to problems perceived by voters, as opposed to saying, we're in a depression, we have this problem. So the focus has to be on solution. I'm doing a county executives race right now. My candidate was on the radio this morning, and one of the promises we made to the voters is we're never going to roll out a problem without a solution. Republicans lost in New York State last cycle because they said there's too much crime, no solution.
What are you going to do about it?
Yeah, right.
Right.
So we're never going to talk about a problem without a solution. The other thing is we're not going to talk negatively about the opponent. We may talk negatively about policies of the opponent and what we can do better. And in fact, a power line that we're going to be using throughout this race is because we can do better. And we'll give examples one at a time.
Let's take it back to the track.
Okay.
You mentioned we don't have a national race per se. Mm-hmm. We have a lot of local races. So when you're driving the horses, you got to look at the local track.
That, you take a look at the pattern of those horses that are in the race, how drivers drive the race. You pick out, depending on if you have a horse that races from back, who you're going to follow at what point of the race, and you have plotted in your mind a way that you're going to win the race using race strategy and tactics that make your horse more powerful rather than every race is the same. And it goes back to exactly the same premise. But there are some horses that are good racing on the front end and some horses that are better racing from behind. Why would you plot the race and do it all the same? You can learn a lot by watching a race.
Well, and then that gets into staying with the analogy. Different horses run better on different kind of tracks. Is it dry? Is it wet? I mean, I don't have this background, but as I think about it, I've heard of like a mudder. A horse that runs well in the mud. Which might not be a bad analogy for a political campaign. There's a lot of mudders out there. So, as you're staying with the track for a moment, and you've done so many different types of campaigns. So a track for a judicial candidate is clearly different from a state legislative candidate. But even within a judicial race, are we talking a city court judge? Are you talking a county court judge? Are you talking about in New York State, the main trial court, which is the state Supreme Court? So it even within a category of a race, you have to think about the uniqueness of those tracks.
Absolutely. So if you go back to Donald Trump's election with Hillary Clinton, there's a really interesting horse race analogy.
I can think of some. I'm going to bite my tongue for the moment.
If you remember, there were a bunch of Republicans vying for the nomination, and Donald Trump, one by one, knocked them all off in ways that people never had thought about, and he would attack them, he'd give them nicknames, he would do all kinds of non-traditional things. Well, when you race a horse on an off track, there are some horses that really don't like mud thrown in their face. And so you have to be steer clear of that. There are candidates who don't want mud thrown at them. That kind of candidate, you have to move to the outside, avoid the mudslinging part of the race. There are so many parallels here that some you race on the front end to avoid the mud, and then you have to control how fast the race goes. But they are absolutely the same thing in elections. Back to the county executive, I have the challenger. That means that ultimately I have to have my guy give the voters a reason to fire the incumbent. But we have to do that without attacking the incumbent personally, because elections are decided by over 53% of the vote coming from women who do not respond well to personal attacks in politics.
If I may, just since you brought up 2016, I want to go back to 2020 for a moment. Mm-hmm. But I want to look at Biden. So he was supposed to be the front runner, and the odds were with him. But then he stumbles out of the gate early on, or at least people claim he stumbled. But then he comes back in South Carolina and outpaces everybody. How would you fit that into your analogy, into the tracks and things? You know, how he went from almost being put into, you finished last, bud, to...
So elections are never run by the candidate. Right. And so so strategically, and I believe it was Claiborne, I think, that did the first, Clyburn. They did the first really significant both get out the vote operation and endorsement operation. The elections are about, as George Herbert Walker Bush once said, Big Mo. They're about momentum. You can have negative momentum, and that can finish you, or you can redefine yourself, which is exactly what happened in that race. They redefined him as the solution to the problem, the 30-plus year experienced deal maker, centrist. They ran him in ways that, were designed to win an election. And that's part of the his problem in this polling right now, because you frame an expectation of who someone is, and then when they violate that expectation, then voters are going, wait a minute, did I get duped here? This does happen a lot. Do either of you like The West Wing?
Oh, I haven't watched it in reruns in years, but yeah.
Yeah, okay. So in The West Wing, Aaron Sorkin wrote brilliant commentaries on elections, and one of the things early on was this New Hampshire governor, Bartlett, that no one saw as viable, and state by state, what they did was they said, there's nothing for us to win there. We're going to go from here to be second, not to be first, and then we're going to go to Illinois, and then we're going to take this guy's money, and we're going to move over here. But the thing is that elections are about strategy. Now, we have seen in some national elections excellent strategy. For example, George W. Bush, in his reelect, won the election by winning the state of Ohio, which he wasn't supposed to be able to win. And the way that they won, Karl Rove designed a way to put the definition of marriage on the ballot in the state of Ohio, and then focused on Amish vote to do a get out the vote move against Amish vote, and as a result won the state of Ohio. Now, that's brilliant strategy. Wasn't designed by the candidate. But it's understanding the state, understanding the race, and designing a way you can win the race.
May I? Yeah. So I want to come back to something you came back to, but you said an election is never run by the candidate, or I think that's you might not have phrased it quite that, which brings up the idea to me, to stay with this analogy. So, one, is the candidate the horse? But two, the difference in the relationship or similarities between the campaign manager as the jockey or the candidate, or is because I think in terms of the horse and the jockey in a horse race as being in a deep relationship with one another, responding to each other. I'm not too certain that's entirely transferable to a campaign.
So let me just change your premise a bit. Let's say there are three entities. There's a horse, there's a jockey, and there's a trainer. So the strategist, the chief strategist, is the trainer.
Okay.
And then the jockey or the driver are typically the campaign manager. And then you have the horse is the candidate. And so what you have to create is a strategist. So there's a lot of elections where I don't manage an election. My focus is on the strategy and messaging. And then I have to get the campaign to buy in, the campaign being the campaign manager and executing what we've designed. And the candidate always has the ability to object to or refuse to do what you're saying and you spend a lot of time saying, okay, but you know, at the end of the day, I'm not going to be the one who on election night loses. It's, you know, and because
your name's not attached to it.
I'm going to do everything I know how to do to win. If you decide to override it, and you know, then election night, you might find out what a really shitty feeling that is.
You're listening to Analogous Propinquity, and we'll get the name right eventually. Jim Bowers and Arnie Rothschild with Paul Baker here as we look at this analogy of political races and horse races, which brings us to the question of identifying the track conditions. And the track conditions are going to be based, Arnie, in part on the track itself. And I'm going to use a harness racing track that some in upstate New York are familiar with, Batavia Downs. That track is a whole lot different in April than it is in August.
No question, that's true. And when you're running an election statewide, for example, you're going to race over a bunch of different tracks and a bunch of different conditions. And in politics, what ends up happening in the course of the cycle, you know, the election cycle, is all those conditions will change, and you have to read them. You have to decide how to adjust your race continuously to the conditions. So back to the when I talked earlier about a mayoral primary and the Siena poll that came out that said we couldn't win, we changed our get out the vote strategy, and because we knew that they weren't able to poll our voters because minority voters are not inclined to answer telephones when they don't recognize the phone number. And then the second thing was we looked at a different dynamic in terms of voters who typically don't go to the polls. And so we had a bunch of volunteers from 1199 Union, mostly females, standing on every street corner on Main Street. And as someone got off the bus, they were asked, and it was 93 degrees that day and 94% humidity, they were asked whether they had voted in the primary. And then the volunteer said, don't get back on the next bus. Get in that air-conditioned van. We will take you to the polling place. So we are actually IDing voters on street corners as they switched buses. The other part of that was, as conditions change, so the Siena poll said up 26. It was a hot, muggy day. The incumbents' voters were in air-conditioned offices all day, saying to themselves, it's really hot and awful. I'm walking out on the street. He doesn't need my vote because he's going to win by a lot. So it suppressed the vote for the incumbent. At the same time, we were increasing the vote for the challenger.
And by the way, I can attest that I was one of those voters who didn't go.
Yep.
Which brings us to a process question. And I'm going to throw this out here. We'll probably get into it later in the season a little bit more deeply, but we do see changes in the political process, which are signs of the times. But we used to choose candidates in a back room with some smart trainers, managers, handlers. Now, candidates, the selection process has changed a bit because we have this primary process.
Yeah, and it's been a continual change since Dwight Eisenhower in 1952. There's been but now we have a more confusing change even in the primaries. There are some states where you can vote in the primary and not be registered to the political party that you're voting with, which to me, I have a very difficult time understanding that.
But it makes a very big difference in that. The primary in New York is not the same as the primary in one of those states that allows, or like Maine, anybody can go.
Yeah. So all politics is in fact local. I went to college in Iowa where there's not a primary. They have caucuses, and they're kind of keggers, and but the
I never thought of that.
It is a constant changing environment, which kind of goes back to what I'm saying. You can't cut the ends off of hams because it's different.
Well, and you can't train the horse to run a race that you're not going to run.
Well, but there's another part of that too, is that, and I realize we're going from local to state to national and all that. That's fine. But if you think about even in this last cycle, 2022, why did you not see the Republican wave that was supposed to develop? In part because the Republican Party primary voters chose horses that ran very well on the primary track, but couldn't run as well on, the statewide, or congressional district track or whatever. And so it's kind of interesting is this even gets back to a point earlier. Different types of candidates run better on different kinds of tracks, and when they transfer to another track, may not do as well.
Well, and let me rephrase that point in that
I'm
question.
trying to stay with the analogy, man.
Well, but
Go ahead.
I'm going to keep it on the primary for the moment. Does the primary become an obstacle to the process?
Yes, because it forces you to spend money to win a primary that you won't have to run in the general. And it's interesting. The Republicans historically have avoided primaries, and Democrats, love them. Elections of today are not about Democrats. They're not about Republicans. It's about what we call unaffiliated voter today. And so, using money in a primary that cuts down your ability to talk to those voters who are going to be the margin. If it in the geography that where we're sitting right now, in rank order, the number one registration is Democratic Party. Number two is unaffiliated voters. Number three is Republican. So, to run a Republican race, you need to run the race differently. Now, the danger of a primary is you're inclined to move to the extreme when you have to run in the middle.
Which again leads us back to this whole point of we have a situation now where in most cases a candidate cannot win based on party affiliation alone. And but we still cling to this, what we refer to as the two-party system.
Mm-hmm. In some geographies, by the way, a candidate absolutely can just win based on the affiliation. So
sure. I mean, if you're in New York State and you're in Orleans County,
not a
problem.
Orleans County Republicans, the city of Rochester Democrats, and then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because in Orleans County this cycle there will be no Democrat candidates, and in the city of Rochester there will be no Republican candidates. But if you go back to this last cycle, there was a dramatic misunderstanding by Republicans caused by polling, because polling in its current construct, and we'll spend some time talking about this, in my view, is dead. And so I heard a lot heading into this election. Abortion is not going to be an issue that drives this election. It is number 6 on the issue matrix, but that was flawed because they left out this question. How important is the issue of abortion when it comes to your deciding to vote? And they don't ask women that way, right? So, you had this amazing number of races around the state where if you looked at the polling, the race looked close, and then if you isolated the women, it wasn't close. So I did, and I want to go back to that 53 to 54% of turnout. I did focus groups around the state where I only talked to women. And for anyone to say abortion was not a driving issue with Republican candidates was lunacy. So we have a lot of old measurements, old metrics that we use that are wrong, including polling.
Yeah, and just to play back to what you said, Paul, I think where your point has the most validity is in those few remaining states, congressional districts, legislative districts at the state level that, use the political science jargon is marginal or competitive. You're right. And when everybody was talking about in New York State that our governor was in this tight race, there's no way in hell the Republican is ultimately going to win. One, because of enrollment. Two, he wasn't going to play well with women. And three, to play back to what Arnie said, he could offer a lot of criticisms, but he didn't really have the plans. He didn't have the solutions to his problems.
I don't want to oversimplify some races.
No, and I don't either.
But I do want to tell you that there is no way in a statewide election in New York State that a pro-life candidate is going to win. And the thing is, there's just no way that was going to happen. The other thing is, I did debate prep in a congressional race. It wasn't my race, but they brought me in to do debate prep. And for the first two nights, and it was the Singletary-Morelli race. For the first two nights, I was pounding LaRon Singletary on the issue of abortion. The consultant from D.C. Replaced me on the third night because he said that's not going to be an issue. The polling makes it number 6. I said, I respectfully disagree. It's going to be the issue that drives this race. And
you want to mention that consultant's name so nobody hires him in the future?
I think that a lot of people have learned that lesson. But back to so it polled 6th. Yeah, but that has nothing to do with GOTV.
And by the way, let me just want to drop something in. This is my way of taking us a little break. The listeners will notice that we are making references to New York State. We are located in Monroe County, in West. I still think of it as Upper West Central New York, or whatever the hell they call it. Particularly, we're in the Rochester metropolitan area. But overall, the topics that we will be discussing throughout this podcast are quite generalizable throughout the country. But just in case you're wondering, we are specifically coming from beautiful downtown Fairport, New York, in the studios of Bill Moran production.
Let's take it outside this geographical area. No, not at the door. Down south. Let's go for a minute. Okay. And I just want to bring this up because we were talking about the whole idea of there are pockets that are partisan. And there is an importance to that in that you can build something off of that. And I take us to North Carolina, where the question was, of 13 congressional districts, why are 10 Republican? And the Republicans say, because we couldn't figure out how to get 11.
So, there's a lot of examples in the South that are only explainable by a change that began in the 60s in terms of, because those were, if you remember, called the Solid South. And then as President Johnson began to drive a lot of issues, including the Voting Act, and a lot of those old line Democrats became Republicans. Gerrymandering is alive and well in every state. I think with the exception of Iowa, I think right now, but I have to tell you that I did a post the broadcasting years, working as a broadcast consultant, did a tour of 23 cities. 3 of them were in Louisiana, and so I was in New Orleans, the one day, and I was in Baton Rouge the next, and someplace even farther, and where in New York State I was seen as a conservative Republican. There, they thought I was a wacky liberal. So this goes back to the fact there is no national Republican Party, no national Democratic Party. There's a bunch of local political operations.
Well, but staying with Paul's reference about we couldn't find a way to get 11. To go back to your analogy, I'm assuming you can't build a track. Maybe you could. That would only favor this horse, and this horse. But we're doing that in elections. Gerrymandering is basically setting up a track that only a particular kind of horse can win. And both sides do it.
But also, by the way, there are kinds of tracks that certain horses can't win on.
But are they built intentionally for that horse not to win on?
They're built.
That's what I'm getting.
Yeah, they're built intentionally to favor a certain kind of horse. So it's not as dramatic as you can't win, but there are artificial surfaces now that favor, kinds of horses that whose feet are actually smaller. That they're called speed feet. In the Triple Crown, there'll be a race run in New York City, in Elmont, New York, called the Belmont Stakes, and they call that racetrack the Big Sandy. So there are horses, those same horses with small feet, sink into that sand deeper, and they're handicapped. So there's a
great track for a camel.
But it goes back to a very basic part of what we're talking about. Every race is different. Every track is different. And if you're doing it the same way, you're going to lose.
Which then brings us to a point, Arnie, and let's bring this home for this segment.
Yeah.
With the thought of reaching consensus in any particular geographical race. So, for instance, achieving consensus in a governor's race. And let's take a few states here. Let's talk about New York. Let's talk about North Carolina. And let's talk about Florida. As Jim noted earlier, in New York State, it's going to be pretty hard for a Republican candidate at this point in our cycle.
No question.
To stick. In Florida, given the way things are right now, it's going to be pretty hard for a Democrat to gain traction. North Carolina, though, is kind of wobbly.
And let me give you one that wobbled and went the other way, and that was Virginia in the gubernatorial election, all based on one issue. The one issue became the rights of parents versus school districts. And a mistake by Terry McAuliffe, the then governor, by saying parents have no role in their children's education, should have no role in their children's education.
Well, he almost took that, and McAuliffe almost took that, though, that was number 6.
Yeah, so changing track conditions, right, that sometimes lead to upsets. That's same as horse racing.
So how do you build consensus then? And that's where we're going to...
Consensus in what?
Consensus as far as getting that middle. And let's take what we're looking at here with, in New York State, Democrats, unaffiliated, and then blanks, and then Republicans. Okay. You got to get that middle to come and play the game.
Well, in 2 of those states, you wouldn't have to build consensus, would you?
In New York and
Florida.
In Florida, no. Not right now, no. But New York is moving a bit as African American vote begins to move a little bit, and as Hispanic or Latino vote begins to move a little bit. But there's a difference between. I had a gubernatorial race. We dropped out relatively early, and if you think of New York, so I want you to geographically, because we talk about New York, but think about these geographies. Long Island is totally different than New York City.
Is totally different than
right.
Westchester.
You get to the Hudson Valley, totally different. You go north to Plattsburgh, it's different. You go south to Tompkins County, it's different. You have central New York, western New York, and then you head to Niagara Falls. Those are all different geographies with all different voter behaviors, all different mix of what you can do, what you can say, how you can run. And I've run elections in all those geographies. There's not any of them that are the same. Which
is intriguing, Arnie, from the standpoint that we often talk about how we have lost regional identity, and yet?
The farther east you go on Long Island, the more Republican the geography gets. As you're moving towards New York City, you have to run a race towards the middle. In New York City, there are some New York State Assembly districts that are a block and a half of high-rises, and then things changed in the Hudson Valley, where, by the way, there's a big block of Hasidic Jewish vote. Just New York is so diverse, that when you're looking at the world of politics, and back to your point, we're talking about New York a lot, but New York is a microcosm of a bunch of states, and it gives you a learning mindset that
the state of New York is in flux.
So it absolutely is, and will continue to be.
Yeah. I have one last question for him, real quick one, as we wrap this episode up. You prefer working with horses or candidates?
Do I prefer horses or candidates? I would prefer horses.
I didn't think you would actually answer it.
And honestly, Arnie, I will just he didn't blink on that one, Jim. It's right there.
And I'll even go a step further.
Please do.
Sometimes the candidate's spouse is a bigger problem than the candidate.
Okay, there we'll stop.
Yes.
The race is on. We will continue this line of questioning with Arnie Rothschild, Dr. Jim Bowers. I'm Paul Baker, and this is Analogous Propinquity.